Let's cut the bullshit.
Just drop the job.
Adam and Simon's Bullshit Busters.
Hello everybody and welcome to Adam and Simon Bullshit Busters. My name is Simon Batchelor.
My name is Adam Bastock.
And this week we are tackling the big question of how bad is lithium. So in lots of discussions I've been having with people recently at net zero workshops, the question keeps coming up of people saying to me, well look, I don't want to get an electric car, or I'm nervous about electrifying this process in my business or installing this kind of battery system because it contains lithium. And I've been hearing lots about in the news or in some other magical sources of some people saying that lithium isn't very good for the environment, and is that the kind of thing we want to be encouraging more of? So we thought this is a perfect case for the Bullshit Busters because there is a clear and present because there is a bullshit. Clear story, because there is a clear level of bullshit around this lithium narrative. So Adam, do you want to get us started by, I guess, talking us through a little bit of the basic facts around lithium, and how bad is lithium?
Yes, everybody attach your seatbelts because I've got my pen and a notepad ready, so we're going to go hard on the fact busting here as my brain kind of spins up. And this is something that we've heard a lot in workshops as well, and I think it's an interesting reason why people are coming to this. In terms of the facts, so there's a couple of articles which we will link to in the show notes where you can find sources for all these figures. But if you look at it from an industrial point of view of what the industry is contributing in terms of carbon emissions equivalent when they are kind of extracting these resources, just to put some context on it. So lithium and cobalt, which are two of the most controversial sort of resources for a lot of electrification, are quite bad for the environment. So they do around 1.3 to 1.5 million tonnes for lithium and about 1.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, for cobalt. So between them, about 3 million tonnes of carbon emissions a year based on mining. If you then compare that to something like natural gas, so obviously that's not always used in cars, but for heating our homes, that's around 7 billion tonnes. So just bearing in mind that I just said billion there, not million. Oil is around 12 billion tonnes of emissions, and I'm not sure if this is including the burning of these either. This might just be in the this is just the extraction process.
Just the extraction.
And then coal is about 15 billion tonnes as well. So suddenly you've got an order of magnitude there of the emissions of, I don't even know what the right number is between those, but going from millions to billions is quite large. And yes, there is probably a question there around the scale of resource, in that we're probably getting a lot more coal out than we are lithium, but I think even then you start to see just this huge disparity in the issues here. This is not to say that lithium or cobalt mining is good.
Yes.
I think anything we produce has got a natural environmental impact to it, but I think there are some less evil options here, and we'll explore that a bit later in terms of the solutions to this and how to handle the objections and to handle the kind of the action here, because I think this is at a global level. There are local benefits as well to an electric vehicle, such as kind of air pollution and health benefits, which we've not got stats on, I'm realising as I'm talking this. But I think there's some other things we can really focus on here, which is just the scale of the problem, in that people often think, and I think this is the biggest challenge I have with the workshops when we've done them, is people will come to us and say, electric vehicles are quite bad, I don't really want them because of all the supply chain emissions. And it's a really interesting thing, because you go, yes, correct, you are right to be worried about the supply chain impacts of that device. However, people are very, very rarely thinking of that about their existing petrol car, in that they go, well, this car has been made and therefore there is no environmental cost for me to keep running it. And that is the issue here. That is the bullshit that we need to be cracking in your heads as people are thinking about this, in that extracting petrol to put in a car is an insane process when you start to think about it. So you've got to get it out of the ground, you've got to refine it. Those refineries have got to be powered by somehow, and quite often that's by, guess what, fossil fuels.
Yeah.
You've then got to get a tanker to move it. You've probably then got to get a lorry on the road to move it once it's been refined to the petrol station, and then you've got to spend fuel to get to the petrol station to refuel it. compared to an electric car where you might just have a solar panel on your roof that's charging it directly. And so there's an order of just energy loss and sort of, what's the word for it? There's a physics word that is this sort of loss at every stage of a process that I can't think of. Will come back to me. But, it is that kind of entropy. You're losing it all the time in terms of that, and it's a really inefficient way. So typically, and I will stop in a minute, Simon, I apologise, but there's a petrol engine is roughly about between 10 and 20% efficient, depending on how sort of effective it is. 80% of that is probably going to be lost as heat, right? Because when you stop your car, you get out, what's that ticking sound? It's the engine cooling down. So if the inverse is then true for electric vehicles, in that if you put 100% of power into a battery, you're going to get about 80% of that out as movement. If you put 100% of energy, i.e. petrol, into a petrol car, you're going to get about 20% of that out as energy. And that's after about a century of progress. So the whole electric car thing gets really interesting because it opens up this whole Pandora's box over energy efficiency, over efficiency of transport, which we'll come back to later, and efficiency of kind of just supply chains. The one last interesting fact that I'll just mention here that I think is really key is there's another article, which again we'll link to in the comments, that I did an episode on Small 99's podcast a few years ago, that 40% of all emissions from the shipping industry come from moving fossil fuels around.
Yeah.
So as soon as you start electrifying, you're not only reducing the emissions from the oil extraction and the oil processing, but also the moving of that kind of oil or that coal around as well, because you're shortening the supply chain, because you're suddenly going from having to get coal out of East Poland and shipping it over to the UK to be burned, which thankfully we're not doing, to then basically getting a solar panel once onto a roof and getting an electric battery once, and then recharging those for decades, basically. So yeah, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think it's all very interesting to compare, and I think the harsh reality of the truth behind the impact of the emissions of lithium is something that just is underreported. So obviously the big fossil fuel companies, their PR machine is working overdrive at the moment because especially in the last 5, maybe 10, probably 5 years, buying an electric car has been an absolute no-brainer for anybody considering a new vehicle. Obviously, with the increase in price of electricity, that's become slightly less attractive to some people. But also, I think the key is that anything that the fossil fuel companies can do to get people to pause before they hit buy on that electric car is a win for them. Obviously, they're in the business of selling petrol. So for my money, whenever someone says to me, oh, well, I'm not going to get this electric car because there's a big battery in it and lithium, it's not very ethical, or it's got lots of emissions, or all this lithium mining is really damaging from the environment, I always have that question for them of like, well, where does your petrol come from? Because the reason we didn't lead with all of the things that are bad about lithium mining is because those things are also bad about petrol, but for some reason we're not allowed to talk about them. No one talks about the deforestation, the immense environmental destruction that goes on just to clear the ground to start making petrol and to put all the wells up. And even if we get into the ethics of it, the people who are mining the lithium and cobalt are working under horrendous conditions. But then if you read anything about oil fields in Nigeria or Kenya, for example, those two have really bad ethics. It's not like petrol has this magical environmental and ethics certificate with it. So I think that's why we didn't focus on both of those, because for my money, they're both as bad as each other. So the real comparison has to be on the emissions.
And I think there's two things here. One is they're both as bad as each other, but one you only do once. So once a battery is made, it's going to exist for around 10 years. So most modern EVs have got guarantees on that battery for about 10 years or 100,000 miles, whichever comes first, which for most people would be the 10 years. Average vehicle mileage in the UK is about 7,000 miles a year. So 10 years, that's 70,000 miles. So an EV will last you probably at least 15 years. And we're seeing that in terms of battery degradation. It's not as much as people think. That is, again, FUD stories, fear, uncertainty, and distrust. And And the second one, I've completely forgotten what my point was, but I think no, it's gone. It was around the kind of the lithium and the kind of stuff, is that once that's built, you can use it as many times as you want. And I think with the oil thing, it's being constantly recycled. Oh, that was it. It was going to be who's saying this around the be very, because I think the problem is people do talk about the environmental damage that oil does. The problem is it's environmentalists. It's not people who are looking to buy cars who are talking about it, and therefore it's seen as an extreme position to hold, and it's not being adopted in mainstream articles outside of like The Guardian, because it's a bit of an ugly truth, right? People already have petrol cars. They don't want to feel bad about themselves, and therefore everyday people are not going to be talking about how bad oil sand is or how bad these issues are. Some people, yes, but they'll be typically treated as a fringe voice. Whereas if you're willing to throw shade on electric vehicles, it's a much more popular opinion. You're fighting against something that's new, and therefore it's less risky, and you're going against the grain. So it's much easier to attack electric cars than it is potentially to support them. And I think it's important to also emphasise that I personally don't think electric cars are the answer. This is not sort of a purely pro EV podcast. There are other alternatives out there which we'll come on to. But yeah, I think it's just important to bear in mind to say these things.
Yeah, and I think, there's been lots of people saying about the lifetime emissions of a petrol car are less than a electric vehicle, because once you take into account the lithium in the battery and the emissions from making that. But as we've just discussed, that is just complete bullshit. It cannot be true. Yeah. There is no way that exists. And often when I ask the people who've said that to me, well, where did you read that, or where did you find that out? They don't know. And that to me is where it gets quite scary, because I'm thinking, well, where is this information coming up? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I've had my, the adverts turned off on my feed or something, or like maybe I'm not part of the right WhatsApp groups. But where does this misinformation come from? I'm struggling to work out exactly where this is being seeded, but it must be getting through because it is coming up more and more. So obviously, the likes of your Ogilvy's and your Havas is definitely doing the work that they set out to do for the big oil firms.
There's a period I had on my YouTube account where it was only after about 11 p.m. at night, but I used to get adverts for Canadian gas that had these beautiful pictures of running streams in Canadian hills that was advertising their gas, and I was getting so fucking infuriated at it. But I couldn't work out how to report it for misadvertising or anything. Yeah. Anyway, I think there's two interesting things. So with Polestar, which is a subsidiary of Volvo, or was, they do have a life cycle assessment report. So you can go on there and they've got 3 different scenarios. Polestar's life cycle assessment of all the energy used to create it and drive it, if it was on a fully renewable grid, if it's on an average European grid, or if it's on a purely coal-based grid. Even on a pure coal-based grid, typically an electric vehicle will be better than a petrol car. The reason why is what I alluded to earlier, in that a petrol car gets about 20% efficiency, and electric vehicles around 80% efficiency. So the transmission loss is much less, because a coal power plant is relatively efficient at generating electricity and then getting that to your electric battery. A petrol car is very inefficient at getting petrol and turning it into movement. It's just that petrol is incredibly energy dense, and therefore you can waste a lot of it and still get power out of it. So frustratingly, petrol is quite good in that sense. The other thing is, I think this is where we're touching on the emotional side, is we've purely talked about facts so far, which we all know as people with marketing backgrounds doesn't really matter. That is bullshit, in that people don't give a shit about facts. They care about how those facts make them feel, which is where they're coming from doesn't really matter to that person, as long as that fact fits their narrative, and therefore they can do it. And I think the reason why people in workshops often push up against adoption of electric vehicles is mostly because it's a really easy reason to do nothing. It's much easier to be able to delay that decision and go, do you know what, I'm not going to get an electric car because I think they might be bad for the environment, or I'll wait and see what hydrogen does. Hydrogen being even less efficient, by the way, for domestic vehicles at least.
You'll be waiting a while.
Yeah, you try transporting hydrogen. It's not. They tried.
They've tried that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
videos
on YouTube about how badly that goes.
It is, however, a very good energy release. Anyway, that is probably slight FUD as well because you don't use pure hydrogen in cars, they're fuel cells. Anyway, we're getting off track. Yeah, people are not doing the electric. People aren't buying electric vehicles because they're going, actually, it's much easier for me to delay this reason to make a change in my life than it would be to do something else. Partly that might be financial, which absolutely fair enough. I'd say that's shifted now as well because the Dacia Duster's just launched, and that is £15,000 as an electric vehicle with a range of about 200 miles, which will do 90% of people in the UK. Like, you know, your nan driving to the shops does not need a 400-mile range battery. And therefore Dacia have not designed a car around that. It's a really interesting utilitarian design thinking vehicle. But I think that's where it's important to focus on this emotional piece of going, actually, why are people saying this? Why are people objecting? Because very rarely is it because they're climate deniers or because they don't believe in the technology. I think most people who are saying, I'm concerned about the lithium, are not against electric vehicles fundamentally. It is an objection handle that you know, marketing would typically work around. Yeah.
I think there's also, like, if we just very briefly also touch on some other objections I have, is one, I won't be able to charge it at home. Now for a lot of people that is the case. However, for most people who live in urban areas, there are, you know, ample chargers around. The other thing is that, you know, people say, oh, well, I couldn't do a long journey that they maybe do once a year, and therefore they're like, well, I couldn't possibly own that car because I wouldn't be able to do that long journey. I mean, I have an electric Mini which has a frankly shockingly shit range of about 100 miles with the wind behind you, and I've driven to Yorkshire and back, and it was absolutely bloody fine because my bladder and my battery are in sync. So when I stop off to have a piss and a coffee, my car gets from about 20% to about 98% in the same time. So when people say, well, I don't want to hang around to charge it, I'm like, how quick are you pissing? Like, you can just calm it down. Do you know what I mean? I think the chargers at service stations are so fast. Like, they almost beat me in... You know, very occasionally I get back to the car and I have to check an email or something, which I'd probably do anyway. And you should be resting when you're driving. If you're driving to Yorkshire with no brake, you shouldn't be doing that. So my point here is that it's all about the journey that you do most often, not the exception journeys that you do once a year. So saying like, oh, well, I have to own this, you know, 7 Series BMW because once a year I drive to Cornwall. It's like, well, you can still do that in an electric car, because 99% of your journeys, or 99.9% of your journeys, are probably under a mile, take around 20 minutes, you know, which is often the stats for the UK. And actually an electric vehicle for that is perfect for that. So yeah, Adam, is there anything you want to add about... There is, I can see.
Yeah, sorry, this is me pulling off a new can of worms that I'm about to kind of dive into very very briefly, hopefully. So I think there's a few things. One, if you start looking at the stats, and there was a blog on the Small 99 website that I wrote about 3 years ago detailing this, most people who own cars also own a house. That the outlier to that is domestic areas, and typically if you're in a terraced house, you're in the worst position for an electric car. But most people who own a home will also have a driveway to charge it, roughly. So it's people in flats normally who don't have a place to charge it. Typically they don't own cars. You know, a lot of the time they actually are city centre, and they might be using a bike, and therefore people like me, well, I hire a car through a car club if I need it for 20 quid rather than owning one. So there's a big piece there around actually understanding the journey that you do, not the technology. And this is the biggest thing, is electric cars are good as alternatives to petrol cars. They are still worse than public transport, and they are a lot worse than an electric bike. You getting an electric bike is far more likely to replace a lot of your journeys with a really, really low carbon alternative that is actually lower carbon than cycling a non-electric bike, because you eat more. And again, a whole separate podcast on that. And I think this is the real key thing here, is the frustration I have with electric vehicles is the size of the batteries, where we're now seeing, I think the new Lotus that's coming out, which is a bit of an outlier in that it's a high performance sports car, is something like 120 kilowatt hour battery in it. That will be able to charge your house for about 2.5 weeks, I think. So I think the average domestic home, if you've got a 3-bedroom semi with like 2.5, two people in it and some kids, I think you get through about 7 kilowatts a day in terms of electricity. It's somewhere around that. So, if you've got 120 kilowatt hours, it's a lot of energy that's sat in that battery.
Yeah.
That frankly doesn't need to be, because you are probably, if you're like most people, driving about 10 miles to the shop and back, or about 7,000 miles a year. Which is where I think we need more super minis, where like the new Renault 5 that's coming out, or the Dacia, Dacia and Duster, I think it is Duster. Again, they've got like batteries of about 30 kilowatt hours. They're relatively small, so then you can get 3 of those into something like a Range Rover sized battery. And understanding what you're buying is also really important on that front, and the size of the battery is an issue. 2 other things very quickly that we've not really mentioned is those rare earth minerals, lithium and cobalt, are used in so many other applications.
Yeah.
A lot of cobalt is used in refining diesel and clarifying it for in the refining process. So you're still using cobalt if you're doing that.
Yeah.
And also
it's also
lithium
used in all of the electrics in your petrol engine.
There you go. So I think it's not as clear cut, and with like lithium as well, typically EV will have, I think, and this might be outdated now, so just do Google this, about 2% or less in terms of an electric battery. So of that 120 kilowatt battery, less than 2% of that weight is actually going to be lithium within that. And that is decreasing over time, because guess what? Lithium is very expensive, and therefore manufacturers don't want to use as much in it. So we're starting to see that decrease. That might be removed entirely in future and be less of an issue. But also, and this is a fact we started this podcast out on, in that the amount of vapes that are thrown away, disposable vapes that are discarded every year, there's enough lithium in those, or enough kind of components in that battery, to produce 1,200 electric cars a year. So I think it's based on like a Tesla Model 3 type battery size. You
Which
can
is
have
big.
1,000. Yeah, that's not a
big
small battery. That's
twice or maybe 3
kilowatts.
times the size of my car.
Yeah. And so suddenly, it's all the background stuff of if you're throwing away phones, and there's a much bigger issue here with just the overconsumption of technology. And I think that's where there's a real issue and challenge, and that's where we kind of spoke about it on the AI podcast, of just why are we using so much technology here? Why don't we actually use what's right for the job, which is probably an electric bike rather than an electric car?
Exactly.
So this is where that pyramid of active travel transport hierarchy comes in, where the best thing to do is to walk or cycle, walk or wheel, then it's public transport, then it's electric car, and then petrol cars, like the worst thing you could do before flying. So, stand down the private jet and get on your bike.
Yeah, I think that sort of neatly brings us to the kind of conclusion that essentially lithium is not good, but it's also not the worst thing about electric cars. And I think it's definitely worth checking, where your preconception about that may have come from. If you are holding that preconception before you start listening to this podcast, perhaps, where does that come from? What is really stopping you making the choice between a petrol car and an electric car? But also, as Adam's pointed out, do you even need a car? Could you be doing a car club instead? Just do some simple maths on that. If you use a car once a week, you probably don't need a car, because your car club will be cheaper over the year than owning or maintaining a car. So very much the key thing to focus on is not the propulsion method of your car. It is, in fact, what is the journey you're trying to make? What's the best way of making that journey? And therefore, do you even need a car in the first place? And if you do need a car, then definitely, open your mind to what are the different ways that car could be fueled. What are the journeys you're making in that car? Do you really need a 400-mile range battery? Do you even need a 200-mile range battery? I mean, I get by charging my car once every 2 weeks on a 100-mile battery, and that is, it really doesn't need that much charging when you use it conservatively in day-to-day in an inner-city environment. So, yes, there we go. There is a whole other tangent we could go down in terms of cars, but actually I think we're going to come back and do a whole episode on basically people moving through cities. I think I've just had an idea for a whole other episode. We're going to come back for that. So if you've got an electric car and you are enjoying using it, let us know. We'd love to know if that's working for you. If you don't have an electric car and you're highly skeptical and you disagree with everything we've said, again, please let us know. We'd love to know why that is. If you have an idea or a topic that you want us to cover, then do connect with me and Adam on LinkedIn and let us know. We're always open to episode suggestions or topics for us to cover. And if you have found this episode interesting, or you think, someone I know who's not buying an electric car for this very reason might find this episode useful, please do share it with them. We're always happy to appear on new people's feeds. So thank you very much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
See you soon, guys. Bye.
Let's cut the bullshit.
Just drop the job.
Adam and Simon's bullshit busters.